Let me see if I can work this thing. Does it work? Sound okay? Okay, what's your name? Lua? Lua, okay, in Norwegian, Lua. Okay, Lua. Daddy said it was going to be all over the place. I'm definitely going to be all over the place. So there's three things that's kind of the key take-home message, because then I'm going to talk a lot about a lot of other stuff. So number one, doing more doesn't equal doing better when we talk about youth sports, talent development, or just enjoyment or whatever. And by doing more, I'm talking about organized, structured, coach-led, controlled, surveillance-driven training, all right? Second is that talent identification doesn't have any predictive value. It doesn't mean it doesn't work, it just means it doesn't have any predictive value. And then the third thing, and it's hard to remember, is that there's an inherent value in sport, and there's an inherent value tied to playfulness and the role of play in sport that we need to kind of govern. And maybe we need to govern that better with some of the external pressures that everybody experiences these days. And if we think about the role of play, and I'm going to focus on the role of play, it plays a key part for learning and development in sport, but it also has an inherent value, and it's counter to some of the more instrumentalist, controlled, coach-led training and competition that we expose our children and youth to, all right? So that's the three things, and I'm going to talk about a lot of other stuff, okay? So I think Silja said it. I'm an associate professor at Norwegian School of Sports Science. I've been there for 20 years. I was a professional handball coach in Norway for 10, 15 years maybe. Worked with a lot of the women that now won the European Championships in December, and some of the men's players. Worked a lot with youth development, but also at the elite level. My background was from sports science, and I've worked as a performance analyst, and now most of my work is kind of across psychology, sociology, and philosophy. So I'm a little jack of all trades. So I'm going to draw on some of those perspectives when we start. I'm going to come back to these questions at the end, and we're going to see if we can land some of them. But what I was thinking about doing, or what I'm going to do, is talk a little bit about the development in society at large, and then how that reflects in sports development, and especially youth sports development. We're going to talk about the consequences of those developments and the opportunity for sport, especially for children and youth, to be something different, to counteract some of those pressures from this accelerated society. And then I'm going to show how some of the stuff that's happening in sport basically is kind of counterproductive of that. And then we're going to see if we can wrap everything around with these two questions. I probably have too many slides. I thought about that when Katie, when you were presenting, you had like your 10 slides, very pedagogical or something, and then my 30 is coming up now. All right. So if we think about society as at large, so a lot of like the Danish professor in psychology, Sven Brinkmann, or the German sociologist Hartmut Rosa, he would say that we live in this kind of acceleration society that is driven by economic growth, technological innovation, and then social acceleration as the main engines. So if you guys don't run faster, if you don't produce more research, more football players, more handball players, or helps produce more commodities or whatever, so the economy grows in Iceland next year or this year, your welfare system is under pressure, right? So our whole societies is currently kind of based on this idea of running a little bit faster from year to year. You follow me? Super. And then what happens then to the psychology, to the well-being of people, and we're talking about children, youth, and grown-ups in that system? Well, it increases pressure and stress. And we can see that when we look at, some of these researchers at least would tie that to the increase in mental health problems and all other kind of psychosocial detrimental outcomes that increases in a world where everybody in a material sense is doing, at least in our part of the world, is doing better. So we're doing good, but we're not feeling any better, all right? And when you look at it in Norway, this is an example from from education. This is me when I started schooling in the early 1990s in Norway. This is my kid brother when he started a couple of years later. And this is my 4-year-old daughter when she's going to start school in a couple of years in Norway. So in Norway, we can see that in all different sectors, education being one of them. So in Norway, we've increased the number of school hours 2 years from I was in general education in primary school and in lower secondary school and until 2008, where kids now spend two more years in school. And I know the figures will be quite similar in Canada, I think, or maybe in North America and all over the world, maybe in Iceland as well. I haven't looked into that. And when you think about the school days for these kids, is that school day more varied? Is it more physical education, more arts-based teaching, or not? Lua? No, it's not. Like, it's in Norway, it's more Norwegian, and it's mathematics, basically. That's 2 years more of mathematics and Norwegian. And there's actually less arts-based education. It's less physical education than it were when I was in school in the 1990s. So all of this stuff is happening. And then, do children spend more time or less time in physical activity? Less, yeah. And then, what do these kids do when they finish school in the evening? Is it more organized activity or is it less organized activity? It's more, so everything is getting more organized. So in an everyday life that's increasingly organized and controlled by adults, where children have fewer places of refuge for free play, organized sports can play an important role. That's one of my take-home messages. But it depends on the quality of that sport experience and how we organize sport for these children. But sport then holds the potential to be something different, to be something that can actually counteract some of these external pressures that children and youth and grown-ups is currently experiencing. So I was talking about the German sociologist Hartmut Rosa. So Hartmut Rosa would say that the consequence of this accelerated society is alienation, which arises from the disconnection and pressure in modern life. And the opposite of that, so his antidote, his counterbalance for alienation would be this experience of resonance. So when people experience resonance, that's when I feel a very strong connection to myself and others, to the activities I involve myself in, or the materials that could be sport as an inherently enjoyable activity. And sometimes even I can experience this deeper meaning, and I can experience that through sports. As a former handball player as well, and as a physically active person, I still experience this deeper meaning of my body, of movement, basically, when I'm training. It can be at the gym, or it can be when I spend time hiking in nature, or running, or cross-country skiing, or whatever. So what we want to do is to see if we can build on those resonance experiences and shape a sports practice that facilitates for these children and youth to experience meaningful relationships with themselves, others, and the world. Play is a key part of that. So play in early childhood, and it says early childhood because it's a quote from a book from two Norwegian professors and researchers in Norway, which is called Lek og læring i et nevroperspektiv, translates to play and learning in a neurological perspective. Have good intentions can inhibit learning and development. So Per and Charlotte wrote that book. So from that book, they write that play in early childhood provides the best foundation for later learning and growth, and we know that play is young children's preferred form of learning. And I would argue that play plays an important part in life for adults and youth as well. And because play is inherently, at least, could be a part of sport has this kind of great potential to it, and is becoming increasingly more important. But it doesn't only serve as a tool for learning, it also serves as kind of an expression of existence. And you can see that when you see young children play. So it's not just about learning, it's about the desire to play is fundamentally a desire to be. It's about being in the world. And it's a different way of being in the world as opposed to this instrumental, very goal-oriented, very purposeful activities that we also engage in to become better at something or whatever. So kind of governing play is something that we need to think about a little bit more. Well, Katie talked to this, Darius talked to this. We can see this kind of social acceleration in sports as well. It's driven by the intensification of training and competition. So when we go back to specialization, my problem isn't with if it's only football, only handball, if it's cross-country skiing and 7 different sports for these kids. It's about the intensification of training and competition and how that changes the quality of those sport experiences. If it's only football, if it's only handball, I think just when you look at the research, I think that why multi-sports practice is usually more beneficial in instrumental terms, it just says something about the quality of, most people that would engage themselves in multi-sports during childhood and youth, they would have like less of this kind of intensified training and competition. And more people involved in singular sports would experience more of these kind of professionalization and commercialization processes. But it's driven by early specialization, intensification of training and competition, performance metrics over enjoyment, where social relationships and well-being is the key emphasis. And you can see that on this instrumental emphasis on performance, all the intensified competitions that we expose kids to, the intense parenting that both Dodi and Katie have spoken to, and the shift in values. So now when we change this youth sport, the youth sport landscape, it also changes those meanings that these young children experience in sport, or these youth. I'm going to show that later. This is just a couple of examples of kind of social acceleration in sports. Lua, was that correct? Yeah. If you're very successful at the junior level, and from my sports in handball and football and stuff like that, that would be about 16, 17, 18 years old. What's the association between being very successful at the junior level and at the adult level? It's none. It's basically none. When we look at the review studies, you can see how kind of intensified training and competition, that is super beneficial if you want to become the best that you can be at age 16 or 17 and 18. But it doesn't translate into adult performance. Does that mean that training doesn't work? No, it doesn't. It just means that there's so many kids, so many youth practicing football or handball or cross-country skiing, and it doesn't translate into performance until after the end of puberty. So when we look at the review studies, we got very, very clear evidence of this. And I have a research career showing that even in football, like the association of becoming an international team player or playing in one of the 5 best leagues in Europe from the Scandinavian countries or some of the best other countries in Europe, it doesn't translate until you're selected to the under 21 national team. So if you're selected to the national team at ages 16, 18, there's no statistical correlation. Does that mean that there's no kids that are in the under 15 team that will be a senior professional player in football? Absolutely not. But statistically, when we group these, there's no association. Handball in Norway, exactly the same way. Athletics, same way, and across all other sports as well. So there's no relationship, basically. But they train more. The best ones at the junior levels, they train and compete more. So it's very difficult to sell that to parents or coaches that it's not about being the best when you're 16, it's about being best in the end, maybe, if that is the goal of youth sports. And then maybe you should step back a bit. And it's a big problem when we organize our talent development models around selection-based talent development, because then it makes really sense to be the best that you can be at the ages of 10 or 12 or 14 or 16 when that selection happens. So all of this stuff does something. This is the Norwegian Football Association's recommendations for training for kids. Pretty okay when you look at activities per week. And this is organized practice. It's not how much time you spend playing football. It's organized coach-led practice. So when you're 6, 7, 2 practices, and then it goes up to 3. But then they added this column a couple of years ago about the additional trainings that they suggested for those who wanted more organized practice. And then it goes up to 6 trainings or 5 trainings or 4 trainings at a very young age. This is E-Triple-P Academy Level 1 Football Academy in England. That's the best football academies in England. So when I compare the organized football practice, coach-led football practice at the under 12 or under 13, 14 level with the football practice that the Norwegian FA recommends for all grassroots sports in Norway, all grassroots football clubs, it doesn't make sense. Because most of these kids in Norway, they would train and compete probably 100% more than what they would do at an E-Triple-P Academy Level 1 in England, where the only goal is to actually sell these kids and get some money back and maybe produce a top-level player or not. They don't really care much about all the other outcomes of sport participation. So there's some things off. I won't go into schooling and kind of the sports school programs in Norway, but most football players in Norway then at the age of 13 maybe now, or would be in a sports school program. So that would just add up on all of that club activity. You could ask me about that later. Okay, Lua, who's your friend beside you? What's your name?
Brian.
Brian, easy to remember. If you're early mature, does that lead to adult success? This was a better question because it's a yes/no question. You got the hard one, eh? So I'm going to rephrase that later, right?
So can you repeat again, please?
Just say no. Okay, yeah. Brian, you're correct. It's no. There's no association. Well, is there an association between early maturation and adult success? No, it's not. But there's a very strong association between being an early mature and being really good in sports through puberty. So this is from the Swedish national selections to the Swedish National Ice Hockey League, ice hockey national team at the ages of under 16, based on historical data in Sweden. And they know now that most of the players that are selected to the under 16 national team, they're categorized as early matures. But when you look at the Swedish players that continue into the NHL, then it's actually the opposite kind of association. So most of those players that end up playing in the NHL, Swedish players, they're late matures, or they're not. If they're not late, at least they're not in that early maturing group. That poses kind of a double problem for us, because when we base when we base our talent development models on selection, it always creates this problem. And it doesn't mean that you can't become good in football or handball or athletics or gymnastics or whatever if you're an early mature. It just means that kind of catering for those different needs is probably different. And when we base on selection, we're basically only catering for those early matures. Will intense training give the best training effect during adolescence? I'm going from Brian and then to you. What's your name? Thelma? Yeah, Thelma. Will intense training give you the best effect on performance? No, it doesn't. I have a research group, one story below me at my university, that have grouped kids and follow them throughout puberty. And then they expose so these are cross-country skiers in this study. They expose them to very, very high-intensity interval training, which is kind of one of the common training modalities in cross-country skiing. They have one group that they try and influence through strength and conditioning, something that's not going to be endurance training. And then they have a control group. And then what they wondered in this study was that they wanted to examine the influence on their maximal aerobic capacity based on those two different training modalities, and one group just being a control group sitting at home playing PlayStation, not doing any cross-country skiing. And what they show is that on very isolated physiological variables, there is you can't separate the influence of puberty on performance development or their maximal aerobic capacity and their training modalities. So there's a slight difference. It looks like there's a slight difference here in the high-intensity training group. It's not significant. It doesn't matter. It's not meaningful in any way. And those kids who were spending their time home eating chips and playing PlayStation, they would improve their endurance capacity throughout puberty. even if they did nothing. And then, does that mean that you can just start training after the age of 16 or 17 or whenever you finish puberty? Maybe not. You'll probably learn something. You'll improve a lot of other different stuff through that training. But it says something about the need for, well, that training doesn't need to be very hard for improvement to take place during adolescence, basically. So it says something about the volume of training, the intensity of training, and maybe even the frequency of training. So there's no very strong incentive to push that hard. How am I doing on time? I'm actually doing quite good. Okay. But what you see now in sports, what you see in society at large, is that this very prevailing focus on early intervention, early achievement in education and sports, it yields very temporary benefits, but it often results in stagnation or dropout during adolescence. And it does something about the experiences, those meaningful or lack of meaningful relationships in sports as well. I forgot one important thing, Lua, when I was going through the educational research, and that is, so the rationale for having kids spending 2 more years at school, what do you think that was, or that is? It's because we want them to get better. We want better scores at the PISA. I don't know if you probably has that in Iceland as well, right? And on those national tests where we compare kids, and on those international tests. So we want them to do better, because in Norway, we were really lacking behind Finland. Who cares what happens in Finland? It's like, if it's a problem that we don't get kids educated and they don't become productive citizens, it might be a problem, but that wasn't the case. It's just we're lacking behind Finland. Okay, so now we're doing 2 more years of schooling. Are we doing better on national tests and international comparison tests? No, we're actually doing a little bit worse. Increase in ADHD and kind of behavior regulatory what's it called, Katie? Medication? Yeah, that's what I'm looking for. Is that increasing? Has it gone up? Yeah. And especially for these young boys, this is a big problem, eh? And then just coming back to this then focusing on early intervention and achievement in sports as well, it's just kind of taking the same logics and bringing it to sports. And I don't think that's a very productive environment for any kids to be in, and especially maybe not those young boys that's kind of not, that doesn't find their place in school and now maybe won't find that place in sports either. Because through our sports practice, when it gets too organized, it also learns these kids a lot about which ways they are supposed to behave to stay in the system, what kinds of values, what kind of norms, what kind of ways they're supposed to behave in order to stay selectable. I'm going to show you that later. Okay, over-control activities, excessive testing, it hinders children's independence, creativity, and self-development by prioritizing external approval over personal growth and exploration. And Katie's touched upon that as well. And there's a couple of Danish colleagues of mine that has done some really, really interesting ethnographical work in grassroots football clubs in Denmark. And they show how these kids learn very early how to sort themselves. You were talking about being labeled as talented, but even in grassroots football clubs, depending on how the coach would organize the practice, you learn to know your place in that hierarchy. And when you know a little bit about the kind of disciplinary logics of sports coaching, you know that kind of when those hierarchies gets exaggerated, it becomes these kind of self-fulfilling prophecies. So it's very difficult, if you know your rank, to actually pass someone in a race if you know that person in front of you is the faster runner. That's an example from my friends at the University of Alberta. All right, when competition and selection, when that dominates at a young age, performance pressure increases, stress and undermines learning and well-being, highlighting the need for age-appropriate selection processes to support healthy athlete development and readiness for elite efforts. I think that's a big take-home thing for you guys to consider, because I think committing yourself to becoming an elite athlete or talent development, whatever, at the age of 13 is very different from trying to, well, make those commitments at the age of 16, just as an example, and going younger would be not that good. Because your social development, your psychological development as children, it kind of increases your reach and your ways of thinking about your decisions and the consequences of your decisions. And at the age of 13, you really don't know much about the world. And then committing at the age of 16, trying something and see if it works out or something is completely different. So your ability to think about the consequences of of the choices you're making is very limited at the age of 13. There was a TV show in Norway a couple of years ago that ran that was called "Våre neste menn." It translates into our next men, where it follows 5 children, they're children, they're 15-year-olds, through 1 year of selection and deselection to the under 15 national football team. And it tells the story. For me, it tells the story of how you can build what talent development does when you organize it in this way, and it is with the best intentions. So it's not like head of talent development in the Norwegian FA or all of the coaches are idiots. It's just when you base a system on this very, very hyper-competitive logics, you will increase stress and pressure. That will inhibit learning and development. Because those kids, all they're concerned with, all their capacities, they're using on just surviving in that environment when they are at those selection camps. So I'm going to see if I can work out a couple of examples, if the technology will kind of help me out here. So the intention of the Norwegian National Talent Pathway, Norwegian FAs, is to identify, stimulate, and develop our most promising 12 to 16-year-olds. Identify players who have ownership of their own development, it's a value, and who can develop into top players at the national and international level. And the Norwegian FA knows that there's no association between how good you are at the age of 12 and and at the senior level, but it's very difficult to kind of do something differently. Okay, so first clip. While competition for selection is not the only part of youth football, it can be seen as the dominant idea in talent identification and development systems. So this is just one example from their first camp. And then see if it plays. No, I'm supposed to. Oh, there it is. If I even get my subtitles in English now, I'm going to be very happy.
Det dere som skal prestere for Norge I årene som kommer, både på aldersbestemt og etter hvert også forhåpentligvis en del av dere på A-landslaget.
Alle vil jo ha den plassen du også vil ha på landslaget. Alle har lyst til å være best hele tiden.
Det ganske stort å få være der, men samtidig så vet du at du må nødt til å prestere, og du kan ikke bare gå rundt og nyte oppholdet.
Om ikke lenge så skal 2003-erne spille sine første landskamper. Mange av dere har lyst til å være med der.
Det jo en landslagsplass det slåss om, og det klinger ganske bra med landslagsplass.
Draktene ligger der, og så kommer dere ut.
Det nå det begynner. Det 15 000 spillere som spiller fotball I alderskullet. Det I snitt 1 til 2 spillere per alderskull som blir en A-landslagsspiller. Så for å bli A-landslagsspiller så må du være den beste I ditt kull. Og være et godt kull så kanskje holder være blant de 2, men så trangt nåløyet da.
Uansett hva statistikkene viser at det 1 som blir, eller 2, eller 3, eller 10. Uansett så bare prøve å gjøre jobben min da, for å bli landslagsspiller.
Du må forberede deg godt til trening og kamp for å være med I det rotteracet som foregår inn på der. Den halvannen timen du trener, så det jo fiender. Mye av grunnen til at jeg tror at jeg har kommet så langt som jeg gjør nå, det egentlig mye lek med ball.
So it's about this 15-year-olds playing football. It's about work. It's about fighting. It's about that rat race. It sounds like they're going to the war in Ukraine and not spending time enjoying football, which is probably what their identity is very, very strongly tied to. So it's just an example of how we can change the meaning of sport for some of these kids. Then I'm going back to, where is my PowerPoint slide? There it is. Okay. So the norms and standards that kind of are reinforced throughout the system, it's strongly enforced through how we communicate as coaches. What we communicate is necessary to achieve success in adulthood. So there's a couple of examples of that as well. So just listen to
Vi
what he
ser etter
says.
spillere som trener mye, som dønn til stede i det de holder på med ute på banen, som pusher grenser, utfordrer seg selv, og spillere som nysgjerrige og reflekterte rundt egen utvikling. Vi vil ha med oss de gutta som elsker dette spillet.
Gikk og tenkte på
det å få lov å ta på seg landslagstrøyen, det et litet snäpp upp. Så Miran, hvis du har lyst å si någonting i forhold til det du erfarte.
Jeg var med i landslagstroppen til Østerrike og Italia. Det ikke noe lett å spille i utlandet når man først der. Det høyt nivå. Jeg gjorde en feil som forårsaket at vi fikk mål imot. 50 minutter av kampen spilt. Alle var bortkastet. Bare på grunn av en liten feil. Og med den feilen lærte jeg at det ikke plass til å gjøre små feil på et landslag. Nå vet jeg hvordan det føles. Og den følelsen, den gjør deg både sterkere.
Learning. Well, they're learning what kind of feelings they're supposed to show and not show, eh? They're learning what they need to kind of, the feelings they need to display to continue to be selectable. And it also kind of teaches them what kind of feelings they're supposed to disclose so that they don't show it to stay in that competition. And it's not my point that taking ownership of your own development and being very passionate and everything is something that is wrong. It's great. But when that's imposed from the system, it kind of acts as only another external pressure that kind of changes the meaning of sport sometimes. Miran in the second scene, he was playing for the under-15 national team, and then he got relegated to the shadow team, which is kind of the B team. And it's funny because when the national team travels around, at least in this show, their facilities, the hotels they're staying at, the pitches they play at are pretty great. And then when you go down to the shadow team, even like the locker room and the classrooms and everything, and where they spend their camps is kind of one step behind. And then what Miran is talking about is the mistake he did in his first national team match. And the coach has him come forward to the group and tell everybody else about that. So he kind of just increases the kind of the seriousness of that environment. And then Miran is talking about the feelings he's not supposed to show. And he's also talking about that idea of not making any mistakes. You can't do that. 5 minutes? 10 minutes?
5 minutes, then we're going to do questions.
10 minutes and then questions, eh? Yeah. Because you said 35. Yeah, okay. And it just says that. So making mistakes is part of learning, eh? So we want these kids to make mistakes. That's a very vital part of their learning experience. I'm going to share this. I'll send them. You can watch the videos yourself. I've subtitled them in YouTube. We're publishing on this, so there's a paper coming out in a couple of months, I hope. And kind of the main emphasis here is just showing how a system based on hyper competition is always counterproductive. And even when you have very, very caring coaches and the best intentions, which obviously to me is what the Norwegian FA and some of the coaches displayed in this series has, it doesn't matter when you create this system that increases pressure and stress. And when you look at, the funny anecdote then, and when you look at these 5 kids now, 5 years later, where are they? Well, 3 of them is playing football at a very, 2 of them are playing football at a very low level in Norway. So they're probably just playing recreational or they're not playing anymore. One of them is still struggling at the third level, probably trying to make a football career. One of them had to stop playing football because of severe mental health issues. He was public in the newspaper. And then the last one is playing professional football at Celtic Football Club in Scotland. So it just tells the story of all these diverse pathways. But if you want to create a good environment, we need to kind of build that up on trust and security, supportive environments that encourages risk-taking, exploration, and persistence, which is essential for effective learning and growth. And risk-taking is something that you don't learn when you don't allow or don't facilitate that children can engage in free play and youth. So that's a problem in our societies now, that children doesn't know how to take risk anymore because they weren't allowed to climb those trees. So when they finally climb that tree at some point, they haven't kind of been exposed to that before. So then sometimes it goes really, really wrong that first time because you didn't climb those small trees, you just ended up in the big one. Learning in sports, and that's my last point, learning in sports is inherently unpredictable and uncontrollable, and it thrives on exploration, adaptation, and the unique pace and experiences of each individual. That's why a one-system-fits-all approach that Dadi was speaking about doesn't work. So when you look at experience, I might need to grow and develop. That would be similar to Dadi's, but it would sometimes always be a little bit different. And at different stages, there's no kind of norm for those stages of development that works at an individual level, even though it describes something at the group level. So that means that the players that are coming up of the academy system in Norwegian football now, they probably know the same stuff. They can do the same, they can show the same skills. They're similar, which makes it even more difficult for them to compete for those professional football contracts because everybody looks the same. So nobody stands out because we've trained them in a curricula that makes everybody become more alike. What we want is kind of building the system on the differences between those unique player qualities that can sometimes kind of spur my imagination of what a good handball player or football player or gymnast can look like in sports. All right. Yeah, I got my 5 minutes now and then questions, or you want me to wrap up now so you get questions? Because it said 35 in the program.
Do you want to speak more?
I want to do the 5 minutes. But if you want questions, I'm here. I'm here for you.
We have some great questions here.
Yeah. We'll do the questions then. I'll wrap up.
Okay, what route do you consider the most efficient for raising a child from birth to becoming an elite athlete? Bang.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I know the answer, so I can share that. Well, number one, you need access to facilities, environment, and good healthy environments, and great coaching if you can have that as well. And by great coaching, I mean grown-ups that can, in a pedagogically sound way, facilitate sound practice, and maybe sometimes just loosely organize or initiate that these kids spend time on that football pitch or in that handball gymnasium instead of just being on YouTube or playing PlayStation or whatever kids do these days. If you can provide access to those facilities and spur their interest and make that accessible and make a flexible system that caters for the individual pace of learning and development, and that idea that motivation is not something you have or not. It will kind of fluctuate throughout adolescence or youth ages. So it is about kind of creating those opportunities where you can be where you can flexibly accommodate your training schedule, where you can have a voice in what to say and how practice is organized. And I think that what we forget when we're studying sports science, for example, is that we become experts at training, and then we forget that these kids' voice in what meaningful training or practice can look like, we forget to actually listen to that voice because I always know the recipe for high-intensity interval training or whatever.
Okay. Elite adult sport is very demanding. So what demands should we put on teenagers in sports, in your opinion?
It's a completely mistaken idea that because life is tough as an adult, then life should be tough as a child or youth. You'll learn that by just being part of professional sports or professional football. So my take on that would be that this idea of building mental toughness or whatever is something we can just leave for adult sports. We don't need to kind of trickle down that into youth sports. Did that answer the question? Kind of?
I think so.
Yeah. So I wouldn't be too concerned with that. I'm concerned about kind of building a youth sports program that are built on kids' interests and what is meaningful to them, and then mental toughness wouldn't be one of them. But they learn a lot through sports about that either way, and they love to compete. So when I'm thinking about kind of decreasing competition, I don't think it's the selection based, it's the ranking, it's the consequences of competition that we want to avoid. It's not letting people compete in football or handball or run as fast as you can and compare that.
Okay, so kids today are doing like few events. What is the appropriate age to choose what event you want to focus on? And also what age is the best for improvement in your event?
Yeah, I was supposed to go back to those initial questions, eh? So thinking about specialization, I would think that, and this is just, it's based on my experience from Norway in particular, but committing yourself to one sport at age of 16 is something we should at least let the system be flexible and open so that you don't need to choose football or handball or cross-country skiing until the age of 16. If it's later, that's perfectly fine as well, but kind of committing at the age of 16 would be kind of, and it has to do with course maturation, it has to do with their psychosocial development, and it has to do with the kind of when you need to increase training loads. So just talking to those increased training loads and adult success, you don't need to increase those training loads in organized practice until a later stage, which is kind of speaking to the second question, I think. Maybe.
Maybe. I have so many here.
Yeah?
Okay, so I think this one's interesting. How does Norwegian sports implement their mantra, flest mulig, lengst mulig, best mulig?
We have the children's rights in sports. So, sorry.
Yeah, and what way is that connected to recent success of elite athletes?
Well, all Norwegians that are successful develop within the Norwegian system. So obviously, both those who's not successful and successful would kind of be part of the same system. We have the children's right in sports that govern children's sports until the age of 12. So formalized ranking, international competitions, formalized talent development, selection-based talent development is not allowed until you're 13 years. That is becoming increasingly important because football and other kind of organizations would kind of try and kind of challenge those regulations, but because it's regulated by law, it's kind of can be enforced as well. I think there's a common value across sport organizations in Norway that we don't want more professionalization or commercialization in this way that I'm talking about. We want more competent coaches, that's great, but we don't want all of these other effects. But in football, it's becoming increasingly difficult to kind of push back because football is this huge economic market-driven beast where everybody wants to look to what they're doing in Barcelona or in Saudi Arabia or in England or whatever and try these kind of copy-paste logics.
Speaking of football, Norway and Sweden produce world-class footballers but struggle as a team. Do you think Nordic mentality focusing on development instead of performance is the reason?
No, I don't think so. I think there's lots of chance factors playing here. We've never had better players coming out of Norway like we had a lot in the 1990s, but some of the players we have now are standout players in the Premier League in particular. And I don't want to go. I'm not sure if I'm the right man to go into that debate. But as a coach, I also know the limits of my coaching and my program. So maybe it's very strange they've never qualified in 20 years. Like Sweden actually qualifies every other year. Norway's just stopped qualifying. But I don't think it has anything to do with the system. And these players are very successful in their club environments. So it shows how team performance and individual performance isn't necessarily connected, eh? And that's why Iceland can compete at the, well, sometimes why Iceland and why Norway maybe in the 1990s could compete at an even higher than what you would rate those individual players at, right?
I'm going to say this is the last question, then you can wrap it up. What steps can coaches take to minimize drama in their sports while positively impacting students' growth and development?
Wow. That's a good wrap up. Well, I think that kind of, I don't know if it probably, if it feels that way in Iceland with this kind of intense parenting styles, that's a problem. So at some point you need to educate the parents. I know that's a big deal in Norway if you work with youth athletes. I think like, so some of the best players I've coached in handball, it's like, it's not the magic I do when they come to training. It's all the stuff I don't do. It's all the stuff, it's about avoiding doing stupid stuff more than it is kind of doing all the right stuffs for them to continue to learn and develop. So if we could base our coaching based on sound pedagogical and ethical and kind of moral obligations as well, because we think that youth sports should be, has this inherent value that I was speaking about, and not only this instrumental value, we also create a good system for performance development. So when we don't distinguish between mass sport participation and elite sports in Norway, that creates, and I know it's the same way in Iceland, it creates tensions. But it is the same mechanisms for me that provides Kristine Bræstad to become a world-class handball player, that it is that also has the potential for more young people to stay involved and engaged in sport. So it's not tension-free, but it is kind of the same mechanism. So don't do stupid stuff, maybe is the is the short answer.
Are that the final answer, or do you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, I'm just going to say, I'm going to send, are we sending out the slides? Yeah, so there's a video here that we won't watch. It's Yannick Bolasie. He was a great player for Crystal Palace 10 years ago when they played the cup final in England. He talks about his development in inner city London and some of the stuff that he values as meaningful in his development and learning experiences in football is something you could never gain through my organized coach-led practice. So you can watch it when you go from home. And then just speaking about the unpredictability of athlete development, these are 3 girls I coached in Norway some years back, and just like who ends up in the end as the best players, you never know. And these are grown-ups. These were grown-ups when I was coaching them in Uppsala, and she was probably, she's never been selected to anything. And all of the chance factors that plays a part, all of the networks that need to come together to create those opportunities, they're inherently unpredictable. And that's it. So now, 10:35, I think I'm on time. Silja? Yeah?
Yes.
Now we're here. Thank you guys for having me.